Yes, very happy to. So the background of this research goes back about a decade, where Julia and I used to be colleagues at the same university. I was a professor of marketing in the marketing department. She was in the supply chain department. And we had a chat about who is held responsible for a supplier incident. And she basically told me that in the supply chain literature, it's very clear or common perception that the focal firm has control over the tier one supplier, but not beyond this. And I said, from the consumer perspective, being a marketing professor, I don't think consumers care. I think they perceive the supply chain as one entity where the focal firm is held responsible. So that was the initial idea of this chain liability paper that was published a couple of years back. But in that paper, we basically pointed at a problem, but we didn't really offer a solution. So this follow-up project, we're actually trying to offer a solution. So we added two co-authors, and that is our co-author Sebastian Forkmann from University of Alabama and Stephan Henneberg from University of Queen Mary. And as a team of four, again, combining the supply chain perspective and the marketing perspective, we actually looked at when chain liability happens. So when it happens that consumers hold the focal firm responsible for a supply chain incident, what should the focal firm do with the supplier? And that's basically the background and the beginnings of this research.
And we actually felt that this focus, this scope of the study has some important implications for supply chain management research. Most of the supply chain management literature that looks at the interface between a company and its supply base is written from a business-to-business perspective. And the consumer, so the end consumer perspective, often is neglected. But this is an important omission because in essence, consumers are the only source of revenue for the supply chain. So it does matter what the consumers think about the supply chain, how their emotions get breached by a scandal, an environmental or a social scandal that can happen in the supply chain, and then ultimately what a company can do to repair such breached emotions. So we felt that this is an important aspect. And then there has been a flourishing stream of literature on sustainable supply chain management. This stream of literature often says, that due to a number of scandals in the supply chain, the topic has become very important. But usually the stance is proactive. So what can firms do to increase the sustainability performance of their supply base? And what we also need, because of those numerous scandals that continue to happen, we need to equip decision makers with some instruments, tools, and techniques about what they can do in response to a supply chain scandal by figuring out, what would it be that consumers expect the company to do, and how can breached emotions, breached trust into a focal firm be repaired from a consumer perspective. So this is our idea. That's the setup of the study.
Julia has explained the gap from the supply chain management perspective, looking at dyads and B2B dyads. The same is true for the marketing literature. So the marketing literature looks at damage management, that's how we call it in the paper, but they also only look at dyads. So they usually look at the focal firm and the consumer. So, and the research is mostly about apologies and compensation to consumers, but we're really short in having research on how to respond to the supplier, directing the response towards the consumer. So, and that's the combined perspective again that Julia and I take. I'm looking at it from a marketing perspective, and together with my co-authors, and she's looking at it from a supply chain perspective. And both literatures just look at the dyad, and that's the gap basically. The gap is also true for theory. So we're looking at, or we're using psychological contract theory as a foundation of our research. And most papers using psychological contract theory again look at dyads, look at two actors, and that's why we're also enhancing the theory with our research. Let's have a quick look at what psychological contract theory is about. Very shortly, it's about beliefs and obligations in an exchange, and it basically says that every actor has expectation towards the actor that they're having a relationship with, even though there's no prior exchange. So even though I would buy from a provider where I haven't bought before, my expectations of how providers in general should act is captured by a psychological contract theory. And the main thing that we took out of that theory is that usually these contracts, psychological contracts, can be breached when there's an incident, and that they usually lead to negative reactions on the one that perceives the breach, and they usually lead to repair efforts by the one that has caused the breach. And there are two major ways to repair these breaches. One is verbal, so you can explain what happened and why it happened and hope that this will repair. And so this is non-substantive. And substantive, which means that you're addressing the root cause of what happened and making credible assertions that there will be a change and that this will not be happen again in future. This is what we take out of psychological contract theory, our theoretical foundation for the paper.
So our hypotheses are then rooted in this psychological contract theory literature. And our baseline assumption is that consumers would typically expect that nothing bad has happened in the course of the production of a good or service. And if they learn that this is not the case, this will result in an emotional breach, yeah? So in an emotional perception that the psychological contract that the consumer holds with the company he or she buys from is breached. And this emotional breach will in turn determine behavioral reactions. And here we looked into purchase intentions. So this is the baseline assumption. And then we turn to this idea, how can firms now try to repair this breached psychological contract? And as Bina has just explained, theory basically tells us that there are two different categories, namely non-substantive responses or substantive responses. Non-substantive could be explanations. There could be things like, well, it wasn't our fault, it was the supplier who committed the breach, so explain the supply chain structure. But then for substantive responses, we actually have a vast stream of literature to draw from in supply chain management that helps us to delineate potential reactions. And that could be either to terminate a relationship with a supplier which was found to commit a social or environmental misdeed. It could be to engage in monitoring, so controlling suppliers' behavior, or in investing in relationships, so by developing suppliers, meaning you send off personnel or you provide financial support or things like this. So we basically had those three options, terminating, monitoring, or developing suppliers. And then we also looked into different, scopes with which these efforts, these substantive efforts can target the supply base. Namely, only the supplier who committed the misdeed or the entire supply base, assuming that maybe there are other suppliers who might have similar backgrounds or might also be inclined to, disregard social and environmental topics. And we also looked into combined versions of those responses. So you can either terminate or monitor or develop, or you can do lots of things simultaneously. So all of this were things that we manipulated in a vignette-based experiment, which Bina will explain.
Yes, so we ran an experiment with consumers as samples where we had 3 points in time to query consumers. So first of all, we queried consumers pre-incident. So we basically gave them a initial framing saying that they're a regular customer of a fashion firm producing jeans, and they have bought a number of times and they're quite happy and so forth. So, and then we measured the psychological incident and we measured the purchase intention. Then they get a newspaper article explaining that there was an incident with a supplier of their focal firm that they have a direct relationship with. And we explain, so it's a newspaper article from a journalist writing about that incident. And again, we measure the purchase intention and the psychological contract fulfillment and all sorts of other variables, of course. Then we waited for about 3 days or a couple of substantial amount of time to avoid demand effects. And then this period of time later, we then exposed them to another article and said, okay, now you've learned about this incident. Here's what they've responded. And then we split the groups up into 9 different, or the large sample that we had, about 600 people, we split them up into these 9 groups that Julia just explained, where we looked into the different responses in terms of development, termination, and monitoring, but we also split them up into these smaller groups where we looked in, for example, whether only the harmful supplier has been developed or all suppliers in that region have been developed. And then we have the last where we combine multiple responses. And so this setup allows us to do 2 different things in the analysis. So because we have these 3 different points in time where we measure, we can do what in experimental design we call within group analysis. So we can look for an individual or for all of our individuals, what happens over time. So, and we find very nice, and if you look at the paper, curves where you see that from the initial level of psychological fulfillment, it goes down and then it goes up again, and for each individual. So there is a damage effect and there is a repair effect. What we can also do with that type of setup, of our experimental setup, is to compare the repair effect for these 9 experimental groups that we have. And basically, after the incident damage effect, how much do they compare? And we do indeed find different types of effects that Julia will explain our findings.
So what could we find? Well, our first hypothesis was about the non-substantive responses that you might take. So those verbal explanations and clarifications. And here we actually found that the purchase intention decreases even more after attempts to merely explain the issue at hand. So evidently, non-substantive responses do more harm than good and probably should be avoided from a practitioner perspective. Now, in terms of the substantive responses, we actually found that all of them are able to restore purchase intention. So while we had this damage after information about the scandal in purchase intention goes up again for all 3 types of manipulations, namely terminating, monitoring, and developing the supply base. But none of these 3 alone is able to restore purchase intention to pre-incident levels. So when we then looked into the combined version where everything is put together, here we could actually find the highest increases in purchase intention. However, again, not to pre-incident levels. So the more is apparently the better, but ideally it doesn't come to such a scandal, because everything that happens that a focal firm can do, at least from what we found from our experiment, is not able to restore purchase intention to the same level as it was before the consumers learned about a scandal. And then lastly, about this question, multiple suppliers or only the one that committed the crime. Yeah? So here our consumers actually perceive that it is enough for a focal firm to target the harmful supplier only, but beware, if you would follow this, the recommendation that would follow it from this, it would mean that you have a higher risk of being exposed to another scandal in future, and that might be even more risky.
Yeah, so with regards to future outlook, one of our most important points is that we have a lot of societal challenges to deal with as society and as scholars. And in our view, the most important point is that we're we're a group of co-authors from different disciplines. And to really tackle societal challenges, you can't stay within your silo of one particular research field. So, and from my perspective, and I'm the marketing person here, together with my co-authors Sebastian and Stephan, we're highly grateful that the supply chain Journal of Supply Chain Management actually opened up to publish a paper that is on the verge of supply chain management and marketing. And we hope that it will get also a lot of readers and recognition from the marketing perspective. So we highly encourage looking into the future, interdisciplinary perspectives in supply chain management and other disciplines as well, of course, to really tackle some of the societal challenges that we deal with.
So in that case, I think we have brought the first piece of insight to the supply chain management literature that benefits from this knowledge about consumer behaviors from marketing. And here we have actually learned that consumers do care. And I think this is more important than it sounds in the first step. So I often hear practitioners saying, well, consumers do not care. The thing is, consumer perspectives and emotions are nothing static, and they have changed significantly over the past years due to multiple public reports about scandals that happened in the supply chain. And as consumers become more educated, their expectations change and they shift. So we have to have an eye on this. It is a very important issue. And while we have learned a lot about how companies can prevent such scandals from happening, we at least gave a few first insights into how companies should react in case that they are inflicted in a scandal in the supply chain.